Welcome to Deadly DeWitt. I'm Christin Haws, and I'm a library clerk at the Vespasian Warner Public Library. I host the library's podcast, which is called the Vespasian Warner Public Library District Podcast. Long name, but worth a listen. The library's podcast covers the library, library services, the library's archive and collections, and local history. It was while I was researching a local history episode that I came across the 22 murders I'm going to discuss. I was researching an episode on the infamous Mayor Pugh, who was a practicing physician before he entered politics. It was during this time that he not only witnessed the murder of former Chief of Police Tony Musser, but he also performed the man's autopsy. The article I found also referenced the murder of another Chief of Police, John Struble, which was witnessed by Tony Musser, who was a night captain at the time. The article also included a list of 22 murders. The author says 23, but I've counted the list multiple times and can only come up with 22, all that he could recall. As it turned out, I had already covered 2 of the murders on the list for episodes of the podcast, and I decided to see what information I could find on the rest. This turned into months of research. You might think it would be easy to find a Scythe murder in the papers, but you would be wrong. As I'm not an historian or professional researcher, and because I have to get through 22 murders in about an hour, this is pretty much an overview of the murders, and unfortunately for some of them, there just wasn't much information to be found. Deadly DeWitt will go through the murders chronologically, which will take us all over DeWitt County, and we'll start in 1855, just a few blocks south of the library on the square where Isaac Wyant shot Anson Rusk's death in the county courthouse. The foundation of the murder was laid in the summer of 1854. There was bad blood between the Rusk and Wyant families over some land. Isaac Wyant was a known bully who had threatened to whip Anson Rusk and had previously horsewhipped Rusk's brother-in-law. When Rusk and his friends met Wyant and his friends on the road to Marion, which is now DeWitt, heated words were exchanged. When Wyant moved to take off his coat to escalate the situation, Rusk shot him in the arm. Medicine being what it was in 1854, the treatment for a gunshot wound to the arm was amputation. In October of 1855, Isaac Wyant walked into the county courthouse, into the county clerk's office, and shot Anson Rusk 3 times, including once in the head. He fled but was captured and brought to trial in 1857, with Judge David Davis presiding. The prosecution team, which included the state's attorney Ward Lamont, C.H. Moore, a young McLean County lawyer named Harvey Hogg, and future President Abraham Lincoln, argued that the killing was a clear-cut case of revenge. Isaac Wyant killed Anson Rusk because Rusk had caused him to lose his arm. However, the defense team, which included Leonard Swett and William Orme, argued that their client was insane at the time of the murder and that his insanity was caused by the excessive administration of chloroform during his amputation surgery. Witnesses claimed that Isaac Wyant had become increasingly paranoid since his surgery, keeping the house shut up even in the summer, even going so far as to threaten his sister because he was certain that Anson Rusk was out to get him. The defense brought in a few doctors, including Dr. McFarland from the state hospital in Jacksonville, who testified to Wyant's insanity. Dr. McFarland claimed that the combination of Wyant's age, history of insanity in his family as his uncle had been committed, and the chloroform all contributed to his insanity. None of the doctors could testify for certain that the chloroform caused the insanity, nor that the insanity would be permanent, but the jury bought their assessment. As a result, Isaac Wyant was found not guilty by reason of insanity, which is one of the earliest known successful uses of the insanity defense in the country. He was remanded to the state hospital in Jacksonville for 3 years, and upon his release, he returned to DeWitt County where he lived for a number of years until he moved to Indiana, where he would one day be found dead in a brush pile on a farm with a bullet hole in his head. What goes around comes around, you could say. A few years after the Isaac Wyant trial, in 1861, W.H. Summers shot Postmaster Roberts to death either in or just outside of the post office in Clinton due to a, quote, slight provocation. I have no idea how slight your provocation has to be to shoot someone, and I don't know exactly what the provocation was for W.H. Summers, as I could find very little information about this case. What I do know is that the murder caused such outrage that mob violence was feared until it was said that cooler heads prevailed. As it was, W.H. Summers' trial was moved to McLean County, where he was found not guilty. As I have no information, I'm left to guess he more than likely pleaded self-defense. This will not be the last case discussed involving a postmaster. 3 years later, in 1864, still in Clinton, a saddler by the name of Justin Hill shot Justice of the Peace Robert Barnett, immediately turning himself in afterward. I have no details on why the shooting occurred. What I do know is that it was a very unlucky Friday the 13th for Robert Barnett, as he was hit twice, once in the neck, with the bullet being removed just below his right shoulder, and once in the right side, with the bullet exiting out of his back. Either wound would have been fatal. As it was, Barnett lingered and didn't succumb to his injuries until Saturday night. Once again, it's said that mob justice was feared, and Hill was taken to Decatur to be held. His preliminary trial was also held in Macon County, with the main trial being held in McLean County. I do not know the details of the trial, only that Hill was acquitted. My guess is once again another successful use of self-defense. What I do know is that Justin Hill resumed his work as a saddler and later went on to serve in the state legislature. He will not be the only politician discussed. 13 years went by before the next murder, and it's the first one outside of Clinton. July 28, 1877, in Creek Township, I think near Lane, William Davenport was riding over to his brother's house, taking his scythe to be sharpened. Eli Bell called out to him from his yard as Davenport rode past, and Davenport stopped to chat with him, Bell leaning on a broom handle on one side of the fence, and Davenport sitting sideways on his horse on the other side, with his feet up on the fence. The conversation turned to money, and like politics and religion, nothing sours a conversation like money. Words got heated because Bell claimed Davenport owed him $2 that Davenport denied owing him, and as they were two grown, mature men, Davenport invited Bell out into the road to settle things. As Davenport got off his horse, he dropped his scythe. Leaning over to pick it up, Bell reportedly took the opportunity to whack Davenport in the head with his broom handle. Davenport retaliated by hitting him in the head with his scythe. The blow resulted in a hole in the back of Bell's skull on the left side. While the scythe did manage to penetrate to the brain, it didn't pierce the membrane covering it. As it was, the injury caused swelling, hemorrhaging, and separation. Bell lingered without regaining consciousness and eventually died a few days later on August 1st. At the trial, Davenport claimed self-defense, and he did have a small wound from being hit with the broom handle. And so Davenport was acquitted. 2 years later, in 1879, over in Kinney, the bad blood between the Wills brothers and their neighbor Thomas Cooley came to an end one November evening when Thomas Cooley was shot to death at the Wills farm. Cooley had ridden over to the farm and demanded to speak with Edmund Wills, who was in the barn. Unpleasant words were exchanged, and Ed Wills demanded that Cooley get off his property. Cooley reached into his coat pocket like he was going for his gun, and Ed Wills shot at him. Brother Robert arrived home just in time to hear the shots. He rushed down to the barn where he was confronted by Thomas Cooley charging at him on horseback. Robert leaped out of the way, fell into a hedge, but still managed to get a shot off. When the horse turned, Cooley fell off and didn't move. The Wills brothers sent for some neighbors to take Cooley back to his house, where he died. At the trial, it was revealed that the bad blood between Thomas Cooley and the Wills brothers, in particular Ed Wills, was the result of Ed Wills sending a reportedly indecent letter to Thomas Cooley's wife while Cooley was away. She forwarded this letter on to Cooley in Missouri, and Cooley rushed back to confront Ed Wills. The matter was apparently settled once Ed Wills reimbursed Cooley for his travel expenses for his trip home from Missouri. The letter in question couldn't be submitted into evidence at the trial because it could not be found. This also wasn't the end of matters between Cooley and the Wills brothers. Cooley repeatedly found reasons to be in conflict with neighbors, and the final conflict that led to the shooting was over a ditch. The Wills brothers wanted to use a ditch that ran through Cooley's land for irrigation. Cooley refused and went so far as to fill in the ditch. He then insisted that the Wills brothers get the Drainage Commission and independent arbitrators to settle the matter of the use of the now filled ditch. However, the Wills brothers considered the matter settled, and anyway, nobody wanted to get involved given the history between Cooley and the Wills brothers. The evening he was shot, he'd ridden over to once again bully Ed Wills about this ditch. Mrs. Cooley testified that her husband didn't have a gun. However, numerous witnesses testified that not only did Thomas Cooley carry a gun, but that they'd repeatedly seen him threaten Ed Wills with it in public. Cooley also reportedly spotted Ed Wills outside of a store talking to some men, walked up, hit him in the head with a rock, and kept on walking without saying a word. Given Thomas Cooley's behavior, the Wills brothers were found not guilty by reason of self-defense. However, Mrs. Cooley brought a civil suit against the Wills brothers for the death of her husband and ended up winning $350 and 40 acres of adjoining land, which was a bit funny considering the Wills brothers had actually been trying to sell their farm just to get away from Thomas Cooley. A February night in Waynesville a couple of years later gives us our first murderous saloon incident. February 23, 1884, Henry Teal, Wiley Marvel, Bryce Alsbury, and some other men spent the night drinking and quarreling in a saloon until it closed. Outside, even more words were exchanged, and as Bryce Alsbury walked away, Henry Teal called him a damned son of a bitch. Alsbury turned and hurried back towards Teal, who called for him to halt when he was 8 to 10 feet away. He then shot him. The bullet hit Alsbury in the chest near his heart, killing him. Henry Teal ended up being indicted for murder, and Wiley Marvel was indicted as an accessory. At the first trial, at the end of 1884, Wiley Marvel was acquitted, but Henry Teal was found guilty. However, the judge threw out the jury's verdict because he felt they didn't fully understand reasonable doubt, which the court found evidence of. Credible witnesses had testified that Alsbury had a slingshot on his person and that he'd made threats, a fact conveyed to Teal by the bartender. Henry Teal was tried a second time in 1885 and was once again found guilty, and once again the judge threw out the verdict, this time due to a couple of the jurors expressing themselves as to Teal's guilt. So, jury misconduct, basically. Teal was tried a third time in 1886. This time the trial received a venue change to Havana, but by this point several key witnesses had disappeared. The state's attorney entered a motion in Latin that I can't pronounce that means the prosecution will proceed no further, but can re-indict at a later time. Henry Teal was freed. It became a non-issue in 1891 after Henry Teal drowned in Louisiana, his inexperience crossing a bayou bridge costing him his life. His body was found 2 days later. 5 years later, in 1889, over in Kinney, James Waldron left home to go to town and then go to either Clinton or Atlanta. Accounts differ, but ultimately it doesn't matter because he didn't go to either. Instead, he went back home to find that his wife wasn't there. He reportedly followed her trail and found her in the embrace of his friend and local merchant, Daniel Lindley. In a rage, Waldron attacked his friend with a knife. He stabbed him twice in the back over his kidneys, slashed his chest, and stabbed him once in the thigh near his groin. I wonder what he was aiming for. Mrs. Waldron fled the scene and reportedly hid all night in a cornfield. Meanwhile, Daniel Lindley attempted to escape to his brother's house, which was something like a half a mile away, but collapsed and died along the way. At first, Waldron didn't realize that he'd killed Lindley, but as soon as he was informed, he turned himself in. At the trial, Mrs. Waldron was the only person who'd witnessed the actual killing. All of the other witnesses could only testify after the fact. And she told a very different story. She said that she was shooing the neighbor's turkeys home when she'd come upon Lindley, who asked about her husband because he wanted to talk business with him. They were engaged in simple conversation when Waldron appeared and attacked Lindley. Even though Mrs. Waldron reportedly had the unsavory reputation that would make her husband's version of events believable, the jury ended up finding him guilty, and he was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He was pardoned after 2 years as he had contracted consumption, and he was allowed to die at home. If you're keeping track, This is the first conviction we've had so far that's resulted in jail time. Another 5 years goes by, and in 1894, over in Farmer City, John Smith ends up killing James Kirkendall. The year prior, Kirkendall came up from Kentucky and occupied John Smith's tenant house. The next summer, there was trouble over a settlement, and Smith ordered Kirkendall to vacate. Kirkendall reportedly did not take this well and threatened to kill Smith, a threat that the man took seriously as he ended up purchasing a gun for protection. On the evening of July 28th, Kirkendall, his wife, and a man by the name of Mr. Boggs were passing by Smith's house when Kirkendall decided not to leave well enough alone and resumed the quarrel. Kirkendall allegedly advanced towards Smith with a club, and Smith fired a warning shot at him. Kirkendall refused to be warned. Smith shot a second time, this time hitting Kirkendall in the side. He staggered into the road where he collapsed and died. At the trial, there was some dispute on whether or not Kirkendall was actually in Smith's yard when Smith shot him. Smith said he was, but Kirkendall's wife and Mr. Boggs claimed that he wasn't. Mr. Boggs went on to say that Kirkendall wasn't carrying a club, but a small bit of fence post, as if that matters when you're set on bludgeoning a man. No other weapon was found on Kirkendall. This case came down to character. John Smith had a reputation for peaceableness. James Kirkendall did not. In fact, multiple witnesses from his native Kentucky, including his ex-wife, and from Bureau County, Illinois, where he'd once lived, testified as to what a garbage human he was. John Smith was found not guilty by reason of self-defense. Remember when I said that we'd talk about another postmaster and another politician later? Well, here we are. A few days after Christmas in 1895 in Weldon, Postmaster John Pace shot and killed Dr. William Taylor, a member of the state legislature, in the Weldon post office. According to John Pace, Dr. Taylor had been having an affair with his wife since 1889. The first hint of this affair was when Mrs. Pace and Dr. Taylor checked into a Decatur hotel as husband and wife. At the time, Mrs. Pace told her husband that it was a joke as the Taylors and Paces were friends. She said that she and Dr. Taylor just happened to check into the hotel at the same time and as a joke checked in as husband and wife, but stayed in separate rooms. Pace accepted that explanation until 1894 when his wife filed for divorce citing brutality. Pace countered, citing that his wife had been intimate with Taylor. The divorce ended up being withdrawn a year later, but the couple never lived together again. Pace had evidence of his wife's infidelity with Taylor, which included an affidavit by the hotel clerk who'd registered the couple and letters that Mrs. Pace had sent to her sister, which said that Taylor had performed 2 abortions for her. Pace intended to use this evidence to file charges against Taylor and the Knights of Pythias, of which they were both members, and to also file a damages suit against Taylor for alienating his wife's affections. Understandably, Dr. Taylor wanted these papers. He went to the post office on the night of December 28th and demanded that Pace turn them over. He first offered him $500. Pace declined. He then asked again, this time with a gun. Mindful that his young son was sleeping in the next room, Pace first pretended the papers were in the safe. He then said they must be in the desk. As he started searching through the drawer, Taylor let down his guard. Pace grabbed his own gun and shot at Taylor 3 times, hitting him twice, once in the left side and once in the right temple, which proved fatal. Given the notoriety of everyone involved, a coroner's jury was convened that night. However, they couldn't come to an agreement. 5 voted for manslaughter and 1 for justifiable homicide. A second jury was convened, and after hearing the evidence, they all voted for justifiable homicide. In March of 1896, the grand jury failed to indict John Pace, and the case was closed. Only a few months after one marriage led to murder, another marriage ended that way. In April of 1896, Ed Poland shot and killed his wife Myrtle and his mother-in-law, Mary McMullen. Ed and Myrtle's marriage was rocky from the I-do's in 1894. Separating and reuniting became a habit until the final straw came when Ed moved Myrtle out to Iowa. Shortly after the move, Myrtle left her husband and came home, moving in with her mother, stepfather, and younger siblings. Ed followed his wife and did everything he could in order to convince her to come back to him. including getting her mail from the post office and refusing to give it to her. On the afternoon of April 3rd, Ed Poland stopped by his in-laws' house on his way to go hunting. That's why he had the shotgun, no worries. And spoke to his wife in the front yard. He told her that he'd give her the mail he had, in particular a letter from a friend in Iowa, if she would agree to meet him later at a secluded location alone. Myrtle, for obvious reasons, declined. However, she and her estranged husband talked in the front yard until Myrtle's mother, Mary, had enough. She went outside to fetch her daughter and make her come in the house. Ed Poland, having enough of his mother-in-law's meddling, shot Mary McMullen in the face with the shotgun. He then shot his wife in the back of the head, leaving their bodies in the front yard as he fled. The chase ended on the railroad tracks where Ed Poland attempted to end his life by jumping in front of a train. However, the freight train was moving too slowly, the cowcatcher did its job, and Ed Poland was thrown off the tracks with minor injuries to stand trial. Due to the fear of mob justice, he was held in Decatur. At the trial, numerous witnesses testified to the shooting, in particular neighbor Martha Fisher, who saw the whole ordeal and heard Poland threaten to shoot his wife right before he did. Poland, of course, denied the threats and claimed to be insane at the time of the killing. He didn't know what he was doing. Dr. McFarland, who'd declared Isaac Wyant insane, performed the examination and declared Ed Poland sane. He was sentenced to life in prison. It's Christmas Day in 1899 in Weldon, and several men are celebrating the holiday by drinking and playing cards at a saloon, as you do. Doc Markham had moved to the county from Kentucky just 10 months prior and had become friendly with a man from Watseka by the name of Murdoch. Murdoch was playing cards with Henry Summers, who was known to have a temper but hadn't fought anyone in years. The two men got into an argument, and because Doc Markham had never heard that minding your business is free, he insinuated himself into the quarrel on Murdoch's behalf. When Summers went to take off his coat in order to escalate the situation, Doc Markham shot him, grazing his side. Undeterred, Summers managed to get a blow in before Markham shot him again, this gut shot proving fatal. Markham ran for it, but was captured and taken to Clinton to be held out of fear of mob justice. At the trial, Markham claimed self-defense. What perhaps worked in his favor was that not only was he and the victim drinking, but so were the witnesses, who were also gamblers, and in fact 4 of them, including Murdoch, were fined for gambling over in Logan County. Doc Markham ended up being found not guilty. Mrs. Summers ended up filing a damages suit against the saloon owners for, quote, selling the whiskey that took away her husband's good sense. Given his reputation, I don't think he had much to begin with. She later filed a second suit on behalf of her son. It ended up taking years and going all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court, which reversed and remanded Mrs. Summers' victory. She died of a heart attack in 1905, leaving her 10-year-old son an orphan. Meanwhile, Doc Markham returned to Kentucky, and in 1901 it was reported that he incurred a fatal injury while helping to haul logs when one of the logs broke loose and rolled over him. Ouch. The first murder of the new century is also the first of our farm animal-related murders, and it happened in August of 1900 in Waynesville, when 68-year-old John Keene killed 45-year-old Park Cunningham. Cunningham and his son Leslie were riding home that evening when their neighbor John Keene stopped them to complain that the Cunningham's hogs were in his corn. Cunningham and his son split up to look for said hogs. Unable to find them, Cunningham again headed for home, and was again stopped by Keene. Unhappy with the situation, words were exchanged, and Keene struck Cunningham with his cane, threatening to whip him. Cunningham jumped off his horse, and Keene slashed him across the middle with his knife, leaving him where he fell. Cunningham eventually got up and made his way back to his son and 3 other men, who fetched a doctor. The wound, which was reportedly 8 inches across and had exposed his internal organs, slashed open his stomach and intestines, and cut one of his lungs, was pronounced fatal. Cunningham lived until the next evening and was able to give a deathbed statement. Keene had turned himself in after the assault, posted bond, and then was rearrested after Cunningham died. According to reports, Keene's and Cunningham's accounts differed wildly about what happened. However, I can't find anything detailing Keene's account. I can only guess that it was a tale of self-defense, and it was one that the jury believed, as they deliberated only 1.5 hours before finding Keene not guilty. A little over a year and a half later, Keene was killed by a Native American man in Oklahoma. He was reportedly, quote, cut to pieces by a corn knife. Live by the sword, die by the sword, as they say. The summer of 1901 saw trouble over in DeWitt. In mid-June, at a church social, local boy Ed Taylor decided that Kentucky native Warren Brewer made some insulting remarks about the ladies of DeWitt and chose to defend their honor. Words were exchanged, and Taylor hit Brewer in the face with a whiskey bottle. Brewer's friend and fellow Kentuckian Clay Condor jumped in to help, and the result was a brawl with Taylor and his friends that saw the Kentucky boys getting whipped and Brewer requiring medical help. A month later, at a band concert, Ed Taylor's brothers spotted Brewer and Condor and yelled to them, "If you fellows are looking for trouble, you can get it right here." Brewer and Condor declined the invitation, but Ed Taylor insisted, leading his friends in yet another brawl with Brewer and Condor. This time, Condor ended up cutting a couple of the men, and Brewer fired his pistol twice, killing Ed Taylor. Clay Condor was arrested immediately by Ed Taylor's father. Warren Brewer, however, escaped and hid in a cornfield, which was all the rage apparently, until he could make it to his employers, where he worked as a farmhand and arranged to turn himself in. At the trial, there was a strong case made for self-defense. Neither Brewer nor Condor were known to be troublemakers, and multiple witnesses from Kentucky and DeWitt testified on their behalf. Ed Taylor, however, was known to be quarrelsome, particularly with young men he considered strangers, and he ran with a crowd that tended to get him in and out of trouble. Only this time, they failed on the getting him out. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before finding Brewer and Condor not guilty. They went home to Kentucky soon after. Our final Saloon murder happened in Clinton just months after Ed Taylor was killed over in DeWitt. I couldn't find very much on the incident. What I do know is that Henry Bowles and Alan Pryor got into it in the Blue Goose Saloon in November of 1901, and Bowles killed Pryor by hitting him in the head with a beer bottle. Bowles pled guilty to manslaughter and was given an indeterminate sentence, which means he had to serve at least 1 year, after which he could be pardoned or paroled. In 1904 in Clinton, a case of mistaken identity resulted in the death of Lydia Grant. A white woman by the name of Mary married a black barber by the name of Jackson. They were promptly run out of town. After her husband's death, Mary Jackson returned to Clinton to live with her parents, the Gerards. It was then that another black barber by the name of Thomas Waters began to court her. When he proposed marriage, she refused. He, like so many men, did not take the rejection well. The night before the shooting, Waters went to the Gerard house and threatened to kill Mary and himself if she didn't come away with him. Strangely, this didn't persuade her, and she again refused him. The next day, September 6th, Waters again returned to the Gerard house, but first he made a stop at the hardware store to rent a shotgun under the pretense of going hunting. I'm sensing a trend. At the Gerard house, he once again demanded to see Mary. However, Mary refused to come outside. Thomas Waters apparently fired the shotgun through the window with the intention of killing Mary Jackson. However, he ended up hitting and killing Lydia Grant, a domestic employed by the Gerard family. Mary Jackson sustained minor wounds from the shooting. At the trial, Waters tried to claim self-defense, saying that Mr. Gerard had a gun and had fired at him. However, the jury didn't buy it, and Thomas Waters was found guilty. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. He was released in a little over 8 years due to good behavior, returning to Clinton and resuming his job as a barber. In 1918, he and 2 other men were busted for bootlegging, and he served 30 days in jail. In 1920, he and another man were busted for barbering without a license. They paid their fines and their license were renewed. As far as I know, that was the end of Thomas Waters' life of crime. Some chickens and a well led to the 1906 murder of 53-year-old Ira Day by 60-year-old James Whitehead in Clinton. In 1904, James Whitehead bought some property from Ira Day. The property didn't have a well on it, but Day said that he could use the well on the property that sat between his and Whitehead's house, which Day also owned, and was being leased by J.E. Jones at the time of the shooting. On August 21st, 1906, the day of the shooting, James Whitehead's wife was shooing some of Ira Day's chickens home when Day came outside and told her in some strong language, peppered with a few insults, to leave the chickens alone, and for good measure, told her that they could no longer use the well. Naturally, Mrs. Whitehead told her husband when he got home from work, and because men are reasonable, rational creatures, he took a bucket and went right out to the well. Naturally, Day came out, and a fight ensued. Day took the bucket away from Whitehead and started hitting him with it. Whitehead tried to back away, but eventually took out his gun and shot Day, hitting him in the head just below his left eye. The shooting occurred in front of several witnesses, including both of the men's wives. Both the gun and the dented bucket were entered into evidence at the trial. Whitehead claimed he carried the gun for self-defense as he left very early in the morning for work, and he hadn't taken it out of his pocket yet when he got home that day. Obviously, the defense claimed self-defense, but James Whitehead's testimony of the events were very confused. He said that he'd hit Day with the bucket twice, that they were several feet apart when he shot, and that Day had his hands down at the time, all of which contradicted the testimony of all of the witnesses to the shooting who said that Day attacked Whitehead, and the testimony of Dr. Edmondson, who'd conducted the autopsy and said that the two men could have only been a couple of feet apart when the shot was fired. In the end, the jury found James Whitehead not guilty. A little over a year later, in Birkbeck, a body was found on the railroad tracks. John Tanneville was a member of a black railroad gang working in Birkbeck, and on the night of October 24th, 1907, they all went to Clinton to get their drink on. Sufficiently imbibed, the group returned to Birkbeck, where a craps game broke out, and apparently turned hostile. Tanneville allegedly cut one of the men, which caused the wounded man and 3 others to chase him. Tanneville attempted to seek help at the Suttons' house, but they turned him away, telling him to go to the railroad boss. 2 men in a buggy later came upon Tanneville as he was looking for an officer and witnessed 4 men, rocks and clubs, chase Tanneville. The men in the buggy kept up with the chaos until Tanneville jumped a fence and the 4 men turned back. Thinking the ordeal was over, the men in the buggy went on their way. John Tanneville's body was discovered on the railroad tracks the next morning by the southbound passenger train. He'd been beaten to death and had been dead for several hours by the time the train came along. 4 men were held for the crime: Dudley Trice, whom Tanneville allegedly cut, William Mundy, Henry Adams, and Portico Baracos. However, the grand jury felt there wasn't enough evidence to indict them, and they were released. 6 years later, in 1913, in Detroit, Michigan, Henry Adams confessed to the murder of John Tanneville. However, he was not brought to DeWitt County because there was no evidence against him outside of his confession. No one was ever tried for the crime. Our final farm animal-related murder took place in 1909 in Clinton. 68-year-old Asher Arnold had been pasturing his horse in a vacant lot across the street from his house and next to 58-year-old John Poland's place. On the afternoon of July 21st, Poland went looking for Arnold and found him at a neighbor's. A loud argument ensued because Arnold's horse was supposedly eating Poland's sunflowers. After many words were exchanged, Poland went home and Arnold went to get his horse. As he started leading the horse home, Poland came back outside and renewed the argument. At first, Poland's wife attempted to get her husband back inside the house, but then she decided to join the argument by accusing Arnold of stealing apples. Arnold replied to this accusation by calling her a goddamn liar. Poland took offense to this and shot at Arnold 4 times. He was hit twice, the fatal bullet entering just above his right eye. Chief John Struble, who would be murdered almost exactly a year later, arrived on the scene quickly as neighbors had been trying to call the police during the argument but had trouble getting through due to a poor connection. A doctor and the coroner also arrived shortly after. At the trial, a case was made for self-defense as it was claimed that Arnold had a knife on his person and possibly a piece of brick in his hand. He also reportedly told Poland that he'd kill him if he came any closer. However, both men were over 15 feet apart at the time of the shooting, and Poland himself admitted that he shot to kill and didn't stop firing until Arnold fell. John Pullen was found guilty of manslaughter and was given an indeterminate sentence, of which he served about a year. It should be noted that during the course of the investigation, it was determined that the sunflowers did not look like they'd been eaten by a horse. Almost a year later, and only days before Chief John Struble would be murdered, an icy freight house worker by the name of James Demery was found dead along the railroad tracks by the ballpark north of the city. He'd been beaten, and there was a hole in his skull behind his left ear, which the coroner felt was probably caused by a bolt or other piece of iron. It was determined that James Demery came to his death by blunt force trauma at the hands of persons unknown. In the course of the investigation, a man by the name of Frank Morrell was taken into custody. He told police that he'd been drinking with Demery and a man by the name of Alex Matthews near the ice plant after working at the freight house. Matthews and Demery were arguing over wages and the division of the money. Matthews told Demery that he'd settle the matter if they went to the jungles north of the ice plant. As they left, Demery allegedly told Matthews, "Don't hit me." Matthews later returned alone, saying he'd killed Demery. Instead of going to the police, Morrell went off to a freight car to sleep. As you do. A night watch somewhat confirmed Morrell's story, saying that at about 9 that night, he saw 2 black men going north along the tracks arguing. He saw neither of them again after that. Alex Matthews was a known troublemaker. He liked to argue with the other black men working in the freight house, and he ended up spending time in jail for threatening to slash their boss with a knife. Sheriff Campbell searched for Matthews, thinking he might have gone to Springfield. He was also known to have lived in Cairo and East St. Louis, but couldn't be found. James Demery's family also couldn't be found, and he was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. No one was ever tried for the crime. A few days later, just a couple of blocks south of the square, Chief John Struble was murdered. Albert Sant had been plagued by a sneak thief who'd been stealing out of the icebox on his back porch. At first, he thought it was just some boys, but when it kept happening, he reported it to the police. He and Chief Struble used a neighbor's yard to conduct a stakeout one night, and the 2 men watched as a stranger entered the yard and crept around. Mr. Sant told Chief Struble to shoot him, but Chief Struble declined. The man left without attempting to steal anything, and so Chief Struble and Mr. Sant called it a night. The thief later returned and finished his felony. Chief Struble then conducted a second stakeout, this time with his night captain, Tony Musser. The 2 men took up their position in the neighbor's yard and again watched as the thief began his prowl. Musser told Struble to shoot him, and again Struble declined. This time the thief backed up near to where the 2 men stood, and Chief Struble chose that moment to pounce, jumping on the thief's back. However, the thief was a larger man and just sort of walked away with Chief Struble hanging on his back. Tony Musser joined the fray, taking the thief down by the legs. Even down on the ground with 2 men on top of him, the thief was able to get a hand in his pocket, pull out a revolver, and fire it over his shoulder, hitting Chief Struble in the head. In the ensuing chaos, the thief escaped, and despite the assistance of other law enforcement agencies, the man eluded capture. In the ensuing months, Night Captain Musser was named Chief of Police, and numerous men were arrested and interrogated. A likely suspect finally emerged in John Weir, but it would be 3 years after the murder before he was found and arrested. John Weir was finally caught in Iowa. He had been talking with some men about Chief Struble's murder, not realizing that one man in the group was a local boy who relayed the story to his father, who took it to the authorities. Weir was arrested and brought back to Clinton to stand trial. Tony Musser was living in Decatur at the time, and he returned to Clinton to identify Weir in court. Despite Musser's ID, Weir's defense produced numerous witnesses who provided him with an alibi, saying that he'd been working on a farm in another city at the time of the murder. As a result, John Weir was found not guilty. No one else was ever tried for the crime. However, Weir was not a free man. At the time of Chief John Struble's murder, John Weir was already on the lam for a parole violation. He was out on parole for disemboweling a man when he violated that parole by almost beating another man to death with a pool cue. After the trial, he was returned to prison to serve his remaining time. Once he was released, he made his way to Bureau, Illinois, where he got into an argument with a man outside of a saloon and shot him in the heart. This time, he was sent to prison for life. Just days after the conclusion of Chief John Struble's trial, Tony Musser would be murdered. But first, we're going to make a stop in Farmer City. U.S. Grant Kendall was apparently having improper relations with the wife of Arthur Jones, who ended up filing a $10,000 damages suit against Kendall for alienating his wife's affections. The suit was eventually dropped on the condition that Kendall stay away from Jones's wife and his house. Kendall did neither. On February 24, 1911, Jones returned home to find Kendall on his back porch with his wife, and he shot him 3 times, killing him. At the trial, it was revealed that Kendall had no intention of ending the affair, telling his daughter and son-in-law that he loved Mrs. Jones, and he didn't care who knew it, which apparently included his own wife, whom was in the process of leaving him at the time. Mrs. Kendall testified that Arthur Jones had been to see her about her husband and told her that if he set foot on his property again, he'd never leave. 2 neighbors testified to the shooting. They also knew of the affair, one being so complicit that he'd been bribed with whiskey not to say anything and to allow the cheating couple to use his house. The defense claimed self-defense, as Jones claimed Kendall leapt towards him with his hand in his pocket, and Kendall was known to carry a gun he said was to kill Jones if he attempted to interfere with the affair. However, when Kendall's overcoat was searched, all they found was some money, cigars, some papers, including the damages suit, a full quart of whiskey, a half quart of whiskey, and a package of fresh beef. The meat was a mystery to investigators then, and it remains one now. The jury found Arthur Jones not guilty, and Judge Cochran returned Jones's gun to him, telling him not to shoot anyone else. It should be noted that Jones's lawyer ended up taking the gun. And finally, we come to the murder of Tony Musser on December 30th, 1913, at the interurban station in Clinton. Carl Pearson worked for the Illinois Central until the strike of 1911, which he was very involved in. He published the strike bulletin as a way to keep strikers informed and continued to publish it even after the strike failed. His favorite use of the strike bulletin was to out and insult men he felt were scabs. He was sued exactly non-zero times for defamation because of this. Tony Musser's life had been rough since Chief Struble's murder. He resigned as chief of police after about a year, his wife filed for divorce, and he moved to Decatur. When he returned to testify at John Weir's trial, he got work in the IC bullpen. This caught Pearson's attention, and he wrote a scathing article about Musser in the strike bulletin, including reviving an old rumor that it had been Musser who'd actually shot Chief John Struble in the chaos, and Pearson even went so far as to insinuate that Musser had killed Struble intentionally. For some reason, Musser didn't like the article. Either by chance or by design, the 2 men ended up at the interurban station at the same time, and Tony Musser proceeded to beat the living hell out of Carl Pearson, to the point that other men intervened and restrained Musser. Carl Pearson started to walk away, stopped, turned, pulled a gun from his pocket, and shot Tony Musser 7 times in front of 40 witnesses. Upon his arrest, Pearson immediately began angling for self-defense, demanding that his booking photo be taken with the blood from the beating all over his face. The sheriff refused. Pearson's lawyer, Frank Comerford from Chicago, demanded the picture be taken, even going so far as insulting the sheriff's wife. For some reason, that didn't persuade him. And so began the defense dramatics of this case. There were rumors of mob justice, of Pearson being spirited away to Chicago for his safety, a writ of habeas corpus, Pearson appearing as the guest of honor at a strike conference after he posted bond, and the trial getting a change of venue to Lincoln. At the trial, the defense argued that Tony Musser had arranged for Carl Pearson to be at the interurban station for the beating. However, their own witnesses couldn't even testify to the plot. There were also multiple witnesses for the prosecution and defense that testified that Pearson and Musser were 7 to 10 feet apart at the time of the shooting, and Musser was still being restrained when the first shots were fired. There was even a question of whether or not the defense had influenced one of their own witnesses. Despite all of this, Carl Pearson was found not guilty. At the same time he was on trial for Tony Musser's murder, he was also being sued for defamation, again, and for wrongful death by Tony Musser's widow. He won the defamation suit, but lost the wrongful death suit. He moved back to Chicago in 1914. A curious postscript to this case. A psychic by the name of G.H. Bryant was performing at the Star Theater, I believe in Bloomington, and the Clinton Daily Public asked him some questions about a robbery that had occurred at the house of Dr. Edmondson, the doctor who'd attended to Chief John Struble after he'd been mortally wounded. After Mr. Bryant talked about the robbery, he then turned his attention to Chief Struble's murder. He said he was killed by a man who was killed in a street fight, and his killer was acquitted in Lincoln. Thank you for joining me. All of the research presented in this program is available in the Clinton and DeWitt County vertical files in the local history section of the Vespasian Warner Library. Most of the information was obtained from searching newspapers.com, which is free when accessed in the library. Some of the murders presented in this program have been covered on the library's podcast, and Assistant Business Manager Logan Janicki wrote about Tony Musser's murder as part of the series he wrote on the 1911 strike for the library's local history blog. You can find links to the podcast and the history blog and more information about the Vespasian Warner Public Library District at vwarner.org.